At this point in the offseason, we have a pretty good idea of how every team's roster lines up at this point, and that makes it good for when it comes to ranking all these players and defenses in fantasy football. So we're going through the top 12 defense rankings for 2024 fantasy football. Make sure to go down first thing, drop a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support, because I'm trying to get us all ready for the 2024 fantasy season. So at number 1 and 2, they continue to be in the same tier as when I did these last rankings just about a month ago. I've got the Cowboys and the Ravens here. And really, coming into the new year, it's like I want to shake things up just for the fun of it. But when it comes to trying to get accurate rankings here, I really just don't see these two teams being outside the top 2. Look, the Cowboys did lose Dan Quinn to be a head coach over in Washington over the offseason. And that's a big loss. He was one of the highest paid coordinators in the entire league last year, and his defensive track record with the Cowboys was excellent. But when you go from Dan Quinn to Mike Zimmer, your drop-off is just not that big, because Mike Zimmer, yes, maybe not the greatest head coach. I'm sure Vikings fans feel that way very strongly, but Mike Zimmer can coach a defense here. So he's the defensive coordinator here, and they also went defensive end round 2 and linebacker round 3 in the NFL draft here. So they're shoring up that defense. They're getting a lot of pieces back in that secondary from injury. So there's going to be a lot of aggressive play once again from that Cowboys front 7 and that entire defense as a whole, including that secondary being a bunch of ball hawks again, because their secondary coach is good and they have some legit talent on that back end. And when it comes to the Ravens, look, the Ravens have such a strong defensive culture that they lost their defensive coordinator this offseason as well. And again, it's very similar to the Cowboys, where it's like, I just don't really see it being that big of a deal. Mike McDonald is now gone. So theoretically, they should have a drop-off defensively. Their defensive culture, though, their defense has always been really, really good. Similar to the Steelers, except I would argue it's been better over the last 20 years collectively than the Pittsburgh Steelers. They bolstered the secondary in round 1, and they got a smaller corner out of Clemson, Nate Wiggins, but he's still a very, very good player, was able to cover very well, played very dominantly, and they also went edge rush in round 3. So they're just bolstering up that defense right there. And I just think that the Ravens are going to be a locked and loaded great defense again in fantasy football. At number 3, this team rose up for me. The Las Vegas Raiders, I have a lot of confidence in this year. Look, let's go through what the Raiders have done so far. So not only did they promote Antonio Pierce to head coach, and Antonio Pierce is such a physical guy who was a former player, similar to the D'Amico Ryans effect a little bit. This guy knows how defense works. He knows how to play the game, and he connects really well with those Raiders players. They wanted him. Specifically, Max Crosby wanted Antonio Pierce. So he's the head coach now. They go out and they make, in my opinion, the most impactful free agent signing, especially now since Kirk Cousins possibly could be a backup his first year. Christian Wilkins, the defensive tackle from Miami Dolphins, they were able to snag him. That's a massive free agent signing right there. That's a huge free agent signing. One of the best in several years, I would bet. Christian Wilkins, players like him do not hit free agency. So the fact that they were able to coax him away from Miami, big deal. That front 7 is going to be spectacular. It's going to open things up for Max Crosby on the edge. They're going to be dominant on the front end. And it was already a really talented defense with guys like Max Crosby. They've got some evolving linebacker talent. They're going to be very, very good. And there's going to be a lot of forced turnovers on the back end because that front 7 is so strong. So the Raiders defense, I've got a ton of confidence in them this year. At number 4 and 5, I've got the Bills and the 49ers defense. So the Bills dropped a spot, and that's what the Bills were initially at 3 and the Raiders were at 4. Now, the Bills defense, they've also got a defensive head coach. Sean McDermott is defense to his core. And ever since he took over, they've had a pretty strong defense. The Buffalo Bills had, especially in fantasy football. Now, they went safety round 2 and defensive tackle round 3 of the NFL draft. So they're, again, adding pieces to make up for some lost guys throughout free agency. They lost Jordan Poyer. They lost a good chunk of their secondary this offseason. So they're replacing those assets right now and also bolstering up the front 7, which is already a pretty strong bunch for the Buffalo Bills. So the Buffalo Bills will do exactly what they always do. They'll get turnovers. They'll make havoc happen. That creates turnovers for the back end as well. So I've got confidence in the Bills to do it again. And then the 49ers defense, look, the biggest concern for me with the 49ers was that they lost Eric Armstead, who's a really good player. They just couldn't afford to keep him because they've got so much talent already, not only on the defense, but in the entire roster. They went corner round 2, which is a good thing. Like, I think they do need to improve that defensive backfield. I think the biggest thing, though, with the 49ers defense is that Steve Wilks, the defensive coordinator from last year, he's out, and Nick Sorensen is in a defensive coordinator. So I'm not going to say that Nick Sorensen is going to be spectacular right now with the 49ers defense. He's going to be better than Steve Wilks. If y'all remember, during the Super Bowl, in a key moment in the game at the end of the game, the offensive coach, Mike Shanahan, had to call a timeout because he hated the defense Steve Wilks was playing. You knew right then and there he was not returning for that season. So Steve Wilks, I think, is going to be addition by subtraction to this defense. And they have so much talent already. They just need the right coach to do it. I think Sorensen's going to be a better fit. The Browns defense at 6 and the Jets defense at number 7. So the Browns defense, again, they're very, very, very talented. Similar to the 49ers, they've got talent on really every level of that defense. Myles Garrett is obviously a stud. Denzel Ward, probably, getting closer to the end of his career, but they do have a very talented secondary as well. They went defensive tackle round 2 to help bolster up that defensive line. So the Browns defense, like from a numbers perspective last year, very, very strong year. And the Browns defense, that's the thing about them, is that the Browns defense, they're getting around above average sacks per year. They're getting a bunch of interceptions per year because that secondary is very strong. So I see another 9 fantasy points per game, maybe a little bit lower because some of their best players are getting older, but they're still going to be a top 10 defense in fantasy. And then the Jets defense, they just have so much talent on every level of that defense. Quincy Williams, Sauce Gardner being a ball hawk, defensive head coach with Robert Saleh. I don't see how they take a downturn this year. Their biggest problem last year, I think, was that without Aaron Rodgers, it just made it tough for them to have any real success from a team perspective. Well, they were still the defense number 4 last year in fantasy football at 9.1 fantasy points per game. Similar to the Browns, they get, Browns had 49 sacks last year, Jets had 48, 17 interceptions. This is a ball-hawking secondary, aggressive defense as a whole, led by a coach that, if nothing else, is very good defensive mind. The Chiefs defense at number 8 and the Steelers defense at number 9. So the Chiefs defense is all glued together by one piece in particular, and it is Steve Spagnuolo. Yes, they lost some guys. They lost Willie Gay, the linebacker, who I thought that was a big loss. Not only that, they lost L'Jarius Sneed in the offseason to the trade to the Tennessee Titans. So theoretically, they have some holes that could potentially pop up. Look, Steve Spagnuolo is one of the best defensive coordinators in the entire game of football. So I have a lot of confidence that he's going to bring it all together again. The Chiefs defense consistently have a really tough schedule because they're obviously the best team in the league if we're talking about Super Bowls here. And yet they have 57 sacks last year and 7.9 fantasy points per game. The Chiefs do something right every year, and that's because the Chiefs have Steve Spagnuolo as their defensive coordinator. He'll tie it all together again this year for another top 10 defense finish in fantasy football. And then the Steelers defense here, Tomlin has relatively, speaking, had a good defense for most of his Steelers tenure. From a fantasy perspective, they're usually pretty strong defense over the past 5 years at least. They got to steal a linebacker in round 3. Peyton Wilson is going to come in right next to Patrick Queen and be a starter right away. Sideline to sideline type of guy, whereas Patrick Queen is more of a stuff it and not let anything past that second layer of defense type of guy. So they've got one really athletic guy, and then they've got one old school run stopper, rush up the middle type of guy. The Steelers will do what they always do. They'll get turnovers, they'll get sacks, they'll have really big games, and then they'll have really bad games. We can expect more of the same of that with the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2024. Now, the Eagles defense is here at number 10, and the Texans defense is at number 11. So with the Eagles defense, obviously if you look at the numbers on the screen, you'll remember just how bad the Philadelphia Eagles defense was in fantasy football last year. 5.9 fantasy points per game. They were the defense number 27 last year. How is it possible? You think about the talent they had. They had Fletcher Cox last year. They had, Jalen Carter, his first year with the Eagles. They have talent in the back. They have talent in the secondary. The secondary is what blew up. And really, they had such horrific coaching. Matt Patricia was their defensive coordinator, play caller for a good part of that back half of the season where they really fell apart. Well, here's what happens. Vic Fangio with the Miami Dolphins last year turned that defense into really good defense. Now he's with Philadelphia, which was originally supposed to happen in 2023. Now it's officially happened. So with the addition of Vic Fangio, it changes everything. Vic Fangio immediately makes the Eagles defense top 10 in fantasy. They went secondary, their first 2 picks, linebacker in the third. They got 2 really good cornerback prospects in this NFL draft, and everything's just going to come together with Vic Fangio running that defense. Eagles have so much talent defensively, it makes no sense why they were not good last year, unless you count in that Matt Patricia was calling the plays. It's different this year with Vic Fangio. And the Texans defense, look, D'Amico Ryans, defensive head coach in his second year, already made that defense improve as time went on last year. They go secondary round 2 and 3, which is the big weakness of their defense, aside from Derek Stingley, of course. So if the guys on the front end develop, they get Danielle Hunter from Minnesota, and you get Will Anderson develop into a good pass rusher. If you've got that secondary intact, there's going to be coverage sacks, and there's going to be forced interceptions from that strong defensive front. So they made the additions to all the right places here. The Texans defense, I see taking the leap this year and being a top 12 fantasy defense. And then the Chargers at 12, rounding it out here. The Chargers have a very similar story to the Eagles, where it's like you look at their roster, you've got guys like Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Derwin James, and it's like, how were they so bad in fantasy football, not just last year, but for the last several years with a defensive head coach? Well, first of all, we've all established this. Brandon Staley sucks. He sucks. That's just the reality of the situation. So Jim Harbaugh comes in, and Jim Harbaugh, aside from being known as a very run-heavy head coach, he's also very well known for having a very strong defense as well. So Jim Harbaugh comes into an already talented defensive squad, and I think he fixes everything because over the offseason, if you remember, he had the choice to move on from either Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa, or he could move on from Mike Williams and Keenan Allen. He chose to move on from the offensive players because he sees the value in having a strong defensive front in football. So those 2 guys are going to come in, play very well again under a coach that actually knows how to get the best out of his talent. So I've got the Chargers easily being a top 12 defense in fantasy football in 2024. Now let me know what you think of the rankings in the comments below, and make sure you go down there, drop a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel.